Bill Maher thought he could just laugh off the backlash from attending a Trump rally until Jasmine Crockett calmly laid out exactly why that field trip wasn't harmless at all. The studio lights were a little too bright. That familiar feeling just before something goes wrong. Inside the small but packed taping room of Real Time with Bill Maher in Burbank, the crowd was warming up. Laughter trickled through the seats, unaware that the moment they'd talk about for weeks wasn't in the jokes. It was in the tension they didn't see coming. Jasmine Crockett sat on the far right of the panel, legs crossed, pen tapping lightly on the cue card in her lap. She didn't demand attention, but she commanded it anyway. Not with flash, not with loudness, just presence. Calm, collected, razor-focused. She wasn't new to confrontation, but she never sought it. Bill Maher, meanwhile, was riding his own wave. Fresh off attending a Trump rally in Bakersfield, he'd stirred a media frenzy all week. Not because he endorsed Trump. He didn't, or at least that's what he kept saying. But because he stood there, laughed with the crowd, clapped along. When pressed, he called it a comedy field trip. When challenged further, he doubled down. "I think people are overreacting," he said in a teaser clip that morning. "You can't fix the country without talking to everybody, even the people who watch Fox and wear red hats. Sometimes they're more fun." That quote had already sparked a firestorm on social media. Some said he was brave, others said he was tone-deaf. But tonight, in the studio, the fire hadn't landed yet. It was still coiled in the wires. Waiting. The panel was mixed. A tech entrepreneur from San Diego who talked too fast, a best-selling author from Vermont who liked to quote herself, and a political strategist from Tallahassee still struggling to get a word in. But Jasmine? She was the one people were watching. Bill leaned back in his chair like he always did, one leg casually slung over the other, sipping from his mug. "So," he said with a grin, "we're talking about the week's outrage, which apparently is me." The audience laughed, polite, unsure. "I go to a Trump rally," he continued. "Not because I love the guy, obviously, but because I want to understand the madness, the tribalism, the merch tables, all of it. It's a comedy show, folks, not a pledge of allegiance." More chuckles. Jasmine didn't flinch. She waited. He turned to her. "Congresswoman Crockett, I'm sure you have thoughts." That was the thing about Bill. He loved poking the bear, but this bear didn't roar. She just adjusted her mic. "I do," Jasmine said calmly, looking him straight in the eye. "But I want to make sure we're clear. This isn't about merch tables or comedy. It's about what happens when people with platforms validate spaces that are openly hostile to others." No spike in her voice, just a plain, direct sentence that cut the room like a razor. Bill raised his eyebrows. "I think that's a little harsh." She didn't blink. "Do you?" He chuckled. "Look, I've always said left or right doesn't matter. Comedy is how we cope. We can't keep pretending talking to the other side is betrayal." Jasmine folded her hands. "But you weren't just talking. You were laughing with people who cheer for some pretty ugly things. You stood there while someone shouted, 'Go back to where you came from,' at a reporter. That wasn't a joke. That was just hate." The laughter stopped. The silence was sudden and tight, like everyone in the room leaned forward a little, even if they didn't mean to. Bill glanced down. For once, no comeback ready. But the moment wasn't done building. Jasmine hadn't even started telling the story that would change everything. Bill shifted in his chair, clearly not expecting the energy to turn so quickly. He gave a half smile, the kind that tried to keep things light. "Okay," he said, "so now I'm responsible for what random strangers yell at rallies?" He laughed. No one else did. "I'm not defending that behavior, obviously. But let's be real. If I'm not allowed to step foot in a Trump rally without being called a traitor, then how are we ever going to fix anything?" Jasmine didn't interrupt. She gave him space to speak. That was her rhythm. Let them talk. Let them reveal the cracks in their logic, then speak. When she did, it wasn't with sarcasm. It was sharper. "I don't think anyone's calling you a traitor, Bill," she said, looking at him squarely. "What I'm saying is that when you show up in spaces where people actively cheer for policies that hurt entire communities, and you laugh along, even as a comedian, it tells the people watching that it's not that serious, that the harm isn't real." He opened his mouth to jump in, but she raised one finger, just barely, and continued. "You call it a comedy experiment, but you didn't walk away from that rally telling the crowd what they needed to hear. You laughed at their jokes, then used your platform to soften the whole thing. The panel was quiet again. The tech guy stopped tapping his pen. The strategist leaned back. Even the author from Vermont had gone silent. Bill exhaled. Okay, but let's not act like I stood there shouting slurs. I was observing. I've always done that. Go where the fire is, then come back and tell the story. And who gets burned in that fire? Jasmine asked. He blinked. What do you mean? I mean the people who don't have the luxury of calling it content, she said. The people who don't get to sit on panels and laugh it off after the cameras cut, because the things they're hearing at those rallies don't stop once the banners come down. Now she turned slightly to face the audience, not for show, but so they could hear it clearly. I represent people in South Dallas who have been threatened, Jasmine said, just for putting a sign in their yard. I've had constituents followed home, screamed at, told to leave stores, all because someone assumed they were the enemy. That kind of energy doesn't come from nowhere. It's fed. It's allowed. And when people with platforms visit those spaces and call it a field trip, it sends a message to the rest of the world that those fears are exaggerated. Bill sat back, surprised. You're saying I can't go anywhere now? No, she replied firmly. I'm saying if you go, you own the weight of it. You want to call yourself an observer? Fine, but if you see the fire, you have to say there's a fire. You can't warm your hands by the flames, and then act surprised when someone gets burned. The room rippled with quiet. Even the control booth upstairs had gone still. Bill leaned forward, no longer joking. You really think I made it worse by being there? Jasmine paused, then answered steadily. I think you made it easier for people to pretend it wasn't that bad. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it stuck. For the first time all night, Bill looked like someone reconsidering his own words, and that made the audience lean in closer. But Jasmine wasn't done. She rested her hands in her lap, calm, but resolute. The studio was quiet. Not because someone told them to be, but because everyone could feel something shifting. There's this kid I met in Fort Worth, she said. He's 17, in honors classes, wants to study environmental law. He told me he doesn't speak up in class anymore. One time he challenged something his teacher said about immigration. The next day, a classmate slid a note into his locker. It just said, "Go back." She let the words hang. That teacher never said anything racist out loud, she added. But she created a space where a kid like that felt safe saying it. Her student wasn't surprised. He just stopped talking. Bill looked like he wanted to respond, but Jasmine kept going. When I asked him why he didn't report it, he just shrugged, said, "What's the point? They'd probably say I misunderstood." A low hum moved through the audience, not laughter, not applause, just silent absorption. That's what I mean when I talk about platforming, she said. It's not about what you say. It's about what your presence gives permission for others to do. Bill sat back again, visibly uncomfortable. Not in the usual comedic way. This wasn't a bit. He was caught between defensiveness and recognition. But don't you think? He started slowly. Some of this comes from people taking everything too personally. I mean, people say things sometimes they don't mean. Can't we just learn to tune it out instead of assuming the worst every time? Jasmine raised an eyebrow. You want teenagers to just tune out when they're told to leave the country? He didn't reply. She leaned in just slightly. What if that was your nephew, your goddaughter? What if someone said that to them, and you knew it was happening, not because they did anything wrong, but because someone else in power made it feel okay to treat them that way? The strategist shifted awkwardly. The author sipped her water. No one else made a sound. Bill tried again. Look, I get that there are real issues, I do. But I'm not in office. I'm not passing laws. I tell jokes. I try to expose hypocrisy on both sides. And you do, she said. Sometimes. But you don't get to escape the impact just because you call it comedy. We all make choices. Where we show up, who we stand next to, and what we say afterward. Those choices matter. He looked at her, not angry, but like someone trying to recalibrate. By now, the audience wasn't watching a debate. They were watching someone learn, right there, in real time, what it feels like to be held accountable by someone who knows exactly what they're talking about. Jasmine settled back in her chair, voice steady. You know what the most dangerous part of all this is? It's not even the hate. It's the people who don't see it as hate. The ones who shrug it off. The ones who go to rallies, hear what's said, and walk away thinking, it was just loud music and funny signs. She turned back to Bill. You're smart. You know better. That's why this matters. He didn't smile. He didn't fire back. He just looked at her. And for a moment it seemed like he actually heard her. But just as the room settled into that silence, Bill made one last attempt to regain control. And it only dug the hole deeper. He leaned forward, fingers steepled, elbows on the desk. His voice dropped lower than before, as if tone could salvage what content couldn't. Jasmine, he began, you make some good points. You really do. But don't you think sometimes, just sometimes, the outrage gets a little performative? Not everything is a 5-alarm fire. The crowd didn't laugh. A few shifted uneasily in their seats. She didn't respond right away. She took a moment, and when she spoke, her words weren't aimed at the panel anymore. They were for the people watching. Those who'd hear this later on their phones, sitting at lunch breaks or riding the bus home from work. You want to talk about performance? She said. Let's talk about what it feels like to be followed. Through a grocery store with your baby in the cart, and someone whispering behind you, asking if you're on benefits. Her voice didn't tremble. It sharpened. That happened to my sister in Midland. Broad daylight. She didn't get to go viral. She just got humiliated, then had to buy milk and go home like nothing happened. Bill opened his mouth, then stopped. This isn't about 5-alarm fires, she continued. It's about the slow burn people live with every day. And when someone with your audience plays tourist in that kind of environment and leaves without naming it for what it is, you're not neutral. You're just quiet at the worst possible time. The crowd was still. Even the cameraman stepped back, as if giving space for what was coming next. You've built a whole brand on calling out hypocrisy, she said. Fine. But hypocrisy doesn't only exist in the left safe spaces. It exists in the red hat chants, in the dog whistles, in the way someone like you can laugh at the chaos from the sidelines and still get called brave for showing up. She paused, then asked, Who does that bravery serve? Bill finally sat up straight. So what? I'm supposed to never leave my bubble. Only talk to people I agree with? That's how we got here in the first place. Jasmine smiled for her, the first time that night. Not smug. The smile you give someone still missing the point. No one's saying don't go, she said. Go wherever you want. Just don't pretend your presence is neutral. Don't act like your silence in the room doesn't echo when you walk out of it. There was something heavy in those words. Not angry, just undeniable. She turned to the audience again. Here's what most people won't say on shows like this. Some of y'all are so used to being centered that the minute someone asks you to see from the margins, it feels like an attack. A few people gasped quietly. Not shock. Recognition. Bill looked toward his producers, not panicked, just stalling for time. Jasmine didn't flinch. "We're not asking for pity," she said. "We're asking for honesty. When you choose where to stand, be honest about what's behind you. Because somebody's always watching?" The strategist nodded slowly. The author set her cup down. Bill looked tired. Not physically, but the kind of tired where you know you're on the wrong side of the moment and can't joke your way out of it. The audience didn't clap. Not yet. They were still processing, still sitting with it. But in the seconds that followed, something subtle began to shift. Jasmine glanced toward the crowd, not for approval, not to pose, just to check if they were still with her. They were. She leaned in, calm as ever, and looked Bill right in the eye. "You've made a career out of saying the quiet parts out loud," she said, voice steady. "But the truth is, the loudest thing you've said this week was nothing." A beat passed, then another. No one moved. Even Bill didn't interrupt. "You stood on that rally floor while people screamed about stolen elections and real Americans. You heard things that weren't just politically different. They were cruel. But you didn't challenge any of it. You called it a comedy safari. You used your show to say it wasn't that bad." She paused, letting it land. "Do you know how many people watched that and thought, 'See? Even Bill Maher gets it. Even he thinks we're not so bad.' They used you as proof, Bill." You became someone's excuse. That was the moment the shift happened. A woman in the third row, a retired teacher from Fresno, nodded slowly with hands folded in her lap. A man in the back leaned forward, elbows on knees. Even the stage crew, used to background noise, was silent. Bill lowered his eyes. Jasmine sat back, not victorious but resolved. "I'm not here to cancel you," she said. "I'm here to remind you words have weight. Silence does too. You don't have to march with extremists to be useful to them. Sometimes all it takes is pretending they're harmless." He looked up. There was no comeback. The author glanced toward Jasmine. "I have to say, I hadn't thought of it like that." The strategist chimed in. "This isn't even about politics anymore. It's about responsibility." Bill exhaled through his nose. Not annoyed, just quiet. Then almost softly he said, "I hear you." It wasn't dramatic. No swelling, music, no confrontation. Just those 3 simple words. But something in the way he said them made it clear. This wasn't a man defeated. It was a man absorbing. Then came the sound. A slow clap, not sarcastic. 1 person in the middle row. Then 2. Then a handful more. No one stood. No one shouted. Just a quiet, sincere applause that grew naturally. Like people weren't sure if they should, but couldn't not. Jasmine didn't smile. She wasn't there for that. She nodded once, calmly, and turned back toward the host. "I hope that," she said, "when you talk about this moment on your next show, you don't just say, 'I got owned by a congresswoman.'" She paused, then said, "I hope you say, 'I listened.'" The lights hadn't changed. The cameras kept rolling. But everything felt different now. Bill glanced toward the side monitor, watching the delayed feed of himself on screen. Then he looked back at Jasmine. "You've got guts," he said. "I'll give you that." She didn't respond. Didn't need to. Outside that studio, the internet was already awake, and the moment was about to explode. The clip hit social media before the credits even finished. Rolling. Someone from the audience had filmed the entire exchange on their phone. The angle was shaky, but the audio was clear. It started with Bill Maher leaning back, then cut to Jasmine Crockett's line. "You don't have to march with extremists to be useful to them." Within minutes, it was on X, Instagram, TikTok. A caption read, Jasmine Crockett just dismantled Bill Maher live on his own show. Calm, precise, real. It was reposted, re-edited, slowed down, turned into sound bites, stitched over footage of protests, school board meetings, everyday people watching from home. Someone set it to soft piano music. Her voice had left the studio and taken root in places she'd never stepped foot in. On the Monday after the taping, Maher opened his podcast with a different tone. Not apologetic, but more measured. Congresswoman Crockett gave me a lot to think about, he said. I don't agree with everything she said, but I heard her. And I get why it landed the way it did. That conversation wasn't comfortable. But maybe that's the point. He didn't pivot to sarcasm. He didn't bury it in jokes. For many, that was the most surprising thing of all. Online responses were divided, as always. Some praised Jasmine, calling her the new voice of reason and the calm we needed in the noise. Others predictably threw around the usual insults. Too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. But something stuck. Later that week, a video surfaced. A teacher in Missouri showing the clip to her senior civics class, then asking, "What does it mean to speak without shouting?" One student said, "It means people can't say you were emotional, just honest." In Austin, a small business owner posted a video with the caption, "I've been watching Bill Maher for years, but last night was the first time I felt like someone on his show was actually talking about people like me." Jasmine herself never made a big statement about it. She reposted a few clips, thanked viewers, then went right back to work. In an interview the following Thursday, a journalist asked if she planned to go back on the show. She smiled and said, "If the invitation's there. But my goal isn't to win arguments on TV. My job is to make sure people who never get the mic still get heard." There was something about the way she said it, plain, unpolished, real, that made the host stop writing for a second. That was the thing about Jasmine Crockett. She didn't storm in swinging. She didn't crush people with volume. She spoke clearly. She told the truth. And she made it so plain that even those who didn't want to hear it couldn't pretend they hadn't. Sometimes the loudest mic drop doesn't sound like a slam. It sounds like a quiet fact, said with so much conviction the room can't look away. And sometimes the biggest shift comes not when someone yells, but when someone listens. That night on television wasn't about political sides. It wasn't about winning a debate. It was about a line being drawn between entertainment and accountability, between presence and participation, between watching harm and walking away unchanged. We live in a world where it's easy to shrug and say, "It's not that deep." But sometimes it is. And the way you carry yourself in those moments tells everyone exactly who you are. If this story resonated with you, share it, talk about it, and remember, the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one yelling. Sometimes it's the one telling the truth and never raising it. Subscribe for more real stories that challenge comfort, confront silence, and leave something behind.